There is a strange prison that millions of people live inside. A prison with no walls, no guards, no locks, and yet, it controls almost everything they do. It decides what they say, what they wear, what they post online, what dreams they pursue, and what dreams they quietly abandon. The strangest part, most people never realize they're trapped because the prison feels completely real. Imagine walking into a room full of people. Immediately, something changes, your awareness shifts, you become conscious of your posture, your face, your voice, your movements. Suddenly, it feels like dozens of invisible eyes are studying you, measuring you, evaluating you, judging you. And from that moment on, you're no longer simply existing, you're performing, you start editing yourself in real time, you choose words more carefully. You hide certain thoughts, you suppress certain behaviors. You become a manager of impressions, instead of a participant in life. But here's the question. What if almost nobody is paying attention to you? What if the audience you're trying so desperately to impress exists mostly inside your own mind? What if you've spent years fighting against imaginary judgments? Psychologists call part of this phenomenon the spotlight effect, but the spotlight effect is only the surface. Beneath it lies something much deeper, a hidden psychological mechanism that quietly steals your attention, drains your confidence, and disconnects you from reality itself. And the more intelligent you are, the more self-aware you are, the more likely you are to fall into it, because intelligence gives you a powerful gift, the ability to analyze. But when analysis turns inward, it can slowly become self-surveillance, and self-surveillance eventually becomes self-imprisonment. This is the story of how your mind creates an invisible audience, why you feel judged, even when nobody is judging you, and how to finally stop performing and start living. Most people believe their biggest problem is other people's opinions, but that's rarely true. The real problem is what they imagine other people's opinions to be. Think about it. How many times have you replayed a conversation in your head, a joke that didn't land, a sentence that sounded awkward, a social interaction that felt slightly uncomfortable? Hours later, you're still analyzing it. Meanwhile, the other person has probably forgotten it entirely. This is one of the strangest asymmetries of human psychology. You remember your mistakes because you're present for all of them. Other people barely notice because they're busy monitoring their own. In a famous psychological experiment, researchers found that people dramatically overestimate how much others notice their appearance, their behavior, and their mistakes. The participants believed they were standing under a spotlight. In reality, everyone else was focused on themselves. Just like in everyday life, everyone feels observed, everyone feels evaluated, everyone believes they're the center of attention. And because of that, nobody is paying as much attention to you as you think, yet your brain refuses to believe it because from your perspective, you are always at the center of experience. Every thought happens to you. Every emotion happens to you. Every embarrassment happens to you. So your mind naturally assumes that your experiences must also be important to everyone else. But reality doesn't work that way. Other people are trapped inside their own perspectives too. They're worrying about their own mistakes, their own insecurities, their own futures, their own fears. The audience you're afraid of is usually too busy worrying about itself to pay attention to your performance, but your brain keeps acting as if the spotlight is real, and that's where the problem begins. Quietly, almost invisibly, self-awareness sounds like a good thing, and to a certain point, it is. Without self-awareness, growth is impossible. You can't improve what you can't see, but there is a point where self-awareness stops being useful and starts becoming destructive. Imagine driving a car. Normally, you focus on the road. Your movements happen naturally. Now imagine trying to consciously control every tiny movement, every adjustment of the wheel, every pressure on the pedals, every blink, every breath. You would become worse at driving, almost immediately. Because some processes work best when they remain automatic, human interaction is the same. Confidence isn't created by monitoring yourself, confidence emerges when your attention leaves yourself entirely. Yet many people spend their lives doing the opposite. They monitor every expression, every word, every reaction, every silence. Their mind becomes a security camera pointed at itself 24 hours a day. Psychologists call this self-focused attention. Instead of experiencing reality directly, you become an observer of yourself experiencing reality. You split into two people, the one who lives and the one who watches. The one who speaks and the one who critiques, the one who acts and the one who judges. Over time, this creates a strange form of exhaustion, not physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion. Because maintaining constant self-monitoring requires enormous cognitive energy. It's like running dozens of surveillance cameras inside your mind simultaneously, and eventually, the system becomes overloaded. This is why many people leave social situations feeling drained. They weren't exhausted from interacting, they were exhausted from evaluating themselves the entire time. Here's where things become interesting. The people who struggle most with this problem are often highly intelligent, not because intelligence causes suffering, but because intelligence increases your ability to simulate reality. Your brain becomes an incredibly powerful prediction machine. You can imagine outcomes, analyze possibilities, anticipate reactions, model future scenarios. These abilities are useful until they aren't, because eventually, the same mechanism that helps you solve problems starts creating new ones. You stop having conversations, you start simulating conversations. You stop living experiences, you start predicting experiences. You stop expressing yourself, you start calculating responses, and gradually, life becomes less about participation and more about anticipation. Neuroscientists sometimes describe the brain as a prediction engine. Your brain constantly tries to predict what will happen next. Normally, this helps you survive, but when directed towards social situations, prediction can become obsession. You start trying to predict what people think about you. Then you predict what they might think about what you're doing. Then you predict what they might think about what you're thinking. The loop becomes endless, a hall of mirrors inside your own mind. And here's the cruel irony: the smarter you become, the more convincing these simulations feel, because they're detailed, sophisticated, plausible. They feel real, but they are still simulations, not reality. Many intelligent people spend years responding to imaginary situations instead of real ones, fighting battles that only exist inside their heads, trying to solve problems that haven't happened, seeking approval from people who aren't even judging them. And somewhere along the way, they begin living inside predictions instead of life itself. Imagine carrying a bucket filled with water every day. You try to move forward, build goals, improve your life, create something meaningful, but there's a hole in the bottom of the bucket. No matter how much energy you pour in, it keeps leaking out. For many people, worrying about other people's opinions is that hole. Every time you wonder how you're being perceived, attention leaks away. Every time you mentally replay a conversation, attention leaks away. Every time you imagine criticism, attention leaks away. Little by little, day after day, the resource being drained isn't confidence, it's attention. And attention is one of the most valuable resources you possess. Neuroscience has repeatedly shown that attention is limited. You cannot fully focus on reality while simultaneously monitoring yourself. The brain simply doesn't have unlimited processing power. Something always gets sacrificed. When your attention is trapped inside self-consciousness, reality receives less of it. You become less present, less creative, less engaged, less alive. And because attention shapes experience, your entire life begins to shrink. The world becomes smaller, not because opportunities disappeared, not because possibility vanished, but because your awareness became trapped inside your own head. The prison was never the world. The prison was where your attention lived. There is another psychological mechanism hiding beneath all of this projection. Most people assume they fear other people's judgments, but often they're experiencing their own judgments reflected back at them. Think about the insecurities you carry. Maybe you secretly believe you're not attractive enough, not successful enough, not confident enough, not intelligent enough. Now watch what happens. Your brain begins searching for evidence. A neutral expression suddenly feels critical, a short response feels dismissive, a random glance feels judgmental. Why? Because your mind uses its own beliefs as a lens through which it interprets reality. If you're harsh toward yourself, the world starts looking harsh too. The outside world becomes a mirror, reflecting your inner dialogue. This is why two people can walk into the same room and have completely different experiences. One feels accepted, the other feels judged. The room didn't change, the people didn't change, the circumstances didn't change, the interpretation changed, and interpretation creates experience. The voice you're afraid of often isn't society's voice, it's your own voice, wearing society's mask. And once you realize that, something powerful happens. You stop trying to control other people's thoughts. You stop fighting imaginary critics. You stop negotiating with invisible judges, and instead, you begin questioning your own assumptions, the assumptions that created the fear in the first place. So how do you escape? Not by forcing yourself not to care. That never works. The harder you fight a thought, the stronger it often becomes. Instead, the solution begins with attention, because attention is where the prison was built, and attention is where freedom begins. The next time you enter a social situation, notice where your attention goes. Does it move outward or inward? Are you listening, or are you monitoring yourself listening? Are you participating or evaluating your participation? The goal is not confidence, the goal is presence. Presence is what confidence looks like. From the outside, when you're fully engaged with reality, self-consciousness loses its fuel source. The audience starts disappearing. Not because you defeated it, but because you stopped feeding it attention. This is why some people seem naturally charismatic. They aren't necessarily more confident, they're simply less occupied with themselves. Their attention is directed outward, toward the conversation, toward the moment, toward reality, and reality rewards attention. The more present you become, the less room there is for imaginary observers, and little by little, the audience begins to fade. Imagine reaching the end of your life, looking back over everything, the risks you took, the opportunities you missed, the things you said, the things you never said, and then realizing something astonishing. Almost nobody was keeping score. The audience you feared wasn't paying attention. The judges weren't judging. The critics were busy criticizing themselves. The spotlight wasn't nearly as bright as you imagined, and suddenly, decades of anxiety reveal themselves as a misunderstanding. You spent years preparing for an evaluation that never arrived, years performing for spectators who weren't watching, years asking permission from people who had no authority over your life. And perhaps the saddest possibility of all, you became so focused on how life looked that you forgot to experience how life felt, because life was never meant to be a performance. It was meant to be lived messily, imperfectly. Authentically. The people who seem most free are not the ones who never feel self-conscious. They're the ones who refuse to let self-consciousness become the center of their existence. They understand something most people never discover. Your value is not determined by observation. It doesn't increase when people praise you. It doesn't decrease when people criticize you. It exists independently of both. And when you finally understand that, the invisible audience begins to fade, the spotlight dims, the performance ends, and for the first time in a very long time, you return to reality not as an actor, not as a product, not as a carefully managed image, but as yourself. And perhaps that's the ultimate freedom, to stop asking how you're being seen and start paying attention to what you're actually seeing, because the moment you stop performing for the audience in your head, life quietly begins again. There is a strange freedom that appears when you stop managing your image. When you stop performing. When you stop checking whether the room approves. You simply return to your own life, your own goals, your own standards, your own path. Quietly. Not because nobody is watching, but because whether they watch or not no longer changes what must be done. And from that point forward, you let the work speak. You let your actions speak. You let reality speak. And there is something deeply powerful about that. Because it feels earned. Not borrowed. Not performed. Earned. And perhaps that's what freedom really is. Not escaping the world. Not escaping judgment. But finally realizing you were never standing on a stage to begin with. The audience was imaginary. The spotlight was imagined. The prison door was never locked.